Good evening, everyone. Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello. We're going to get started if you don't mind taking your seats. Hi, Jenny Starr. Nice to see you. I'm Carrie Coogan. I am the Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Public Affairs for the library. Thank you all so much for being here tonight for our very popular Making a Great City series that began in 2018. We've been doing this for a while. The series is designed to explore, encourage, and foster both healthy and inclusive development in the Kansas City metro area. And I want to offer a special thank you to Dennis Strait and his team from Multi-Studio, who I see some of them here as well. Thank you all so much for your time and effort and energy in planning these events with us. We couldn't do it without you. I'd also want to thank another strong partner in this work, Alan Howes, who I think is also here. Hi, Alan. Thank you. Alan is the Assistant County Administrator of Unified Government of Kansas City, Kansas, and Wyandotte County, and he has also done a lot of work planning and energy and effort to make sure that we're including the metro area and both sides of the state line in our program planning. So thanks so much, Alan, for your help as well. You can find many of our past programs on our website, kclibrary.org, and so I encourage you to check out some of our other programming. Before we get to our featured speaker tonight, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Beth Hill. Beth is the Community Resources Manager here at the library, and she started her career as a teacher in higher education, and she worked there for 20 years, and then she went back to school and became a social worker. We're now very lucky to have her and her team here at the library. Beth is the person who coordinated this Mentimeter question, who you may have answered that question when you walked in. And she is part of our dedicated team of library staff who serve our community's most vulnerable patrons every day and provide support and information on how and where to access service agencies for help. And so she's going to come up and talk a little bit about what we do here at the library. One quick housekeeping note is that we will be taking questions after Jenny speaks, and so we just ask that you use the microphone, and we will also be taking questions for those of you watching at home, and you can just put it in the chat. So without further ado, please welcome Beth Hill.
Hi, nice to see you all. Thanks for coming. And thanks to the 10 people that answered the Mentimeter question. I appreciate it. Thank you. And guess what? You answered correctly. Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, the reality is, yes, Unfortunately, the reality is that in order to afford that $1,083 apartment, you would either have to work 68 hours a week on minimum wage, or you need to be making $20.83 every hour. Now, that doesn't mean, even if it's minimum wage, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a little money left over, but keep in mind that that scenario right there is eating up between 50 and 60% of your monthly income. And that's what we have in Kansas City. And part of the reason why I'm doing this is because before these talks happen, which I think are great, and give you a national perspective, I want you to know what's happening locally as well. And we're dealing with this every day. Anybody that's in the library system or anybody in Kansas City downtown or in Kansas City in general is seeing this problem more and more and more. And we see 700 patrons a month that we're working with and giving them resources and making connections and making referrals and doing other things to try to help them get to the next step. We can move on to this slide. Yes, thank you. And my colleagues, Jimmy and Savannah, are going to be handing you out this document. And on the back side of that document, you're going to see a QR code. And on that QR code, you can access two different reports. One is a gap report that comes from the National Low Income Housing Coalition from this year. And the other one is the state of eviction in Kansas City, which comes from the Heartland Center for Jobs and Freedom. So you can check those out on your own. And now I have the honor of introducing for our individual who will be introducing our guest speaker. Dennis Strait is a friend of the library, and I was reading up a little bit about Dennis, and a quote that was on his website says, "To be thought leaders, we need to seek the essence of problems to have any hope of finding real solutions. Otherwise, we will always be chasing symptoms rather than addressing the cause." And right now, in regards to homelessness, I think we're doing a dandy job of chasing symptoms. But tonight, you're going to hear about some solutions, and Dennis will start us off. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It is so wonderful having the library as a partner. Let me see, all right. So welcome to the Making a Great City series. This year we're focusing on housing, and it's great to see all of you here to try and learn about how we got to this point. And our speaker tonight is going to give us a lot of enlightenment in that regard. Our previous speaker talked about how the homelessness problem is essentially a housing problem. Our next speaker is actually going to be Bill Dietrich with the Downtown Council. He's going to help us understand how the resurgence of downtown is also a resurgence of housing, and how the housing in downtown has played a major role in the revitalization of our city. We're also going to be hearing later in the year from the Strong Towns group about the new book they have released that also addresses this issue. We're trying to get as many perspectives on the table as possible, and you're going to hear a wonderful one tonight. This is our 6th year in the Making a Great City series, and tonight will be our 18th presentation. And we're excited to keep getting this word out. The idea behind the series is to help people understand the economics behind the way we build our city. One of the points we've made over the last 6 years is that the way we've grown over the last 75 years has made us poor primarily because of all the infrastructure we built. Because now each of us in this room who are a resident of Kansas City have 4 times as much infrastructure we have to figure out how to maintain in order to pay for our city, and frankly, we can't. And that's part of the reason we have challenges, including the housing challenge. The Strong Towns Group has helped everyone understand that this is not just a Kansas City problem. The amount of infrastructure we've built over the last 75 years has just overwhelmed almost everything. And we've got to figure out a new way forward if we're going to ever get on top of creating healthy cities again. I'm going to skip over this and try and keep us into reality for a little while. One of our speakers talked about how we can start to see our city in a different way. And it's these things that are helping us to see where we're creating great value that we need in our city in order to have the resources to address some of our challenges like housing. We need more of that area that's in the warm tones in that map, and you can see it's just a very small part of our overall city. So helping people understand how we can develop and build more economically successfully is part of the goal here, and it's one of the things that we'll be hearing about tonight. Ultimately, you'll learn that the housing problem is one of the most complicated public problems that we've ever had. And so there's no silver bullet. Somebody was asking about that tonight. But there is a simple way to think about the solution so we can at least see where we're going. And the solution looks a lot like this. We need to build as much of this as possible, as quickly as possible over the years ahead in order to solve this imbalance that we have, because we have a shortage of housing. And what's surprising to most people is that most of these aren't single-family homes. Most of these are a version of multifamily homes that we just can't build anymore because of the policies that we've created. So in addition to our situation being a development and infrastructure problem, it's also a policy problem, and you're going to hear about that tonight. So let me see if I can do a proper introduction. Dr. Jenny Schuetz she earned her PhD in public policy from Harvard University, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA with the highest distinction in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia. Before joining Brookings, she served as a principal economist for the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System. She was previously an assistant professor at the University of Southern California and a postdoctoral fellow at New York University's Berman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. Dr. Schuetz is a non-resident senior fellow at GWU's Center for Washington Area Studies and teaches in Georgetown's Urban Planning Program. She's an economist, an author, and a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, where her research focuses on improving housing and land use policies. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Jenny Schuetz.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everybody involved in putting together this series. When I first got the invitation from Carrie and Alan, I was sort of joking that I'm a big fan of public libraries. They're one of my favorite institutions. They're such an important part of the social and cultural infrastructure of cities that we often just take for granted. And I think it's fantastic that you have a whole speaker series about making a great city. So when you take great cities and public libraries and put them together, this is like the overlap of Venn diagram of my favorite things. So very excited to be here. All right, so I'm going to share with you some of the highlights from my book, Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems, which I started writing at the beginning of the pandemic, finished 2 years ago, and in the 2 years since I finished it, the housing crisis has not solved itself, amazingly. In fact, in some ways, it's probably gotten worse. So I like to start by giving you sort of the really long version of this. For those of you who don't follow the ins and outs of New York City and state level politics, this gentleman is Jimmy McMillan. He is the founder of the Rent is Too Damn High party. It's a single issue party, so he runs for office so that he can show up at debates and say the rent is too damn high, and who could really argue with that? So New York, obviously, this has been a problem for a long time, but if we look at sort of the history of how we got to where we are, we can see that the problem is just fundamentally we haven't been building enough homes for a number of decades. So this graph is showing you the amount of housing production adjusted for population going all the way back to 1970. Those of you who work in the real estate industry will recognize it's very spiky. It goes up, it goes down. But over this long time period, over many decades, we have a downward trend. We are building less and less housing per person than we used to. And that's a problem because actually we have smaller and smaller households, so we need to be building more homes per person to provide places for people to live. And of course you can see from the, does this have a, whoops. You can see from the big drop off at the end there, the Great Recession really put us into a very deep hole. We stopped building homes altogether for about 4 or 5 years. People couldn't get mortgages, builders couldn't get loans. And then we started slowly climbing our way back out up until the start of the pandemic. Nationally, we're about 3.8 million homes short of the number we need just to keep up with population growth. And of course, that problem is much more acute in parts of the country that have been building too few homes for longer. So I live in Washington, D.C., which stopped building enough homes even earlier than that. Places like California, Seattle, Boston, New York, the problem goes back to about the 1960s or 70s. And unfortunately, they've been exporting their housing shortage to the rest of the country. Since the start of the pandemic, a lot of people realized that they could live in places like Kansas City or in places like Nashville that had been very affordable. And so people have been moving to these cities and driving up prices, and the supply just hasn't adjusted. It's not that the market doesn't know how to build homes. We have created layers and layers of policies and regulations that make it hard to build homes, and especially that make it hard to build homes in the places that people most want to live, the places that are close to jobs and transit and services and great public schools. So Dennis has already kind of given away one of the secrets, which is that we have made policies that make it hard to build anything except a single-family detached house with a yard on most of the land, not just in our suburban areas, but in our core cities as well. So more than 3/4 of the land in most of our cities is reserved for single-family detached homes. Those are the biggest and most expensive homes for people to buy or to rent. They take up the most amount of land, and so they make it hard to add housing capacity. But we have developed zoning rules and other kinds of regulations that prohibit attached townhouses, multifamily buildings, really everything except this sort of basic building block. And if we think about examples that we're all familiar with, if you walk through any neighborhood where homes were built prior to about 1930, you're going to see a mixture of homes on the same street and the same block. This is an example of a sixplex, a 6-unit apartment building in Richmond in the Fan neighborhood. We used to build 4- and 6-unit apartment buildings like we build single-family homes. These weren't fancy, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, walk up with a single stair. So a pretty basic apartment building, relatively inexpensive, but these are illegal to build basically anywhere now. This is an example of some really skinny row houses in Baltimore. Places like Baltimore and Philadelphia, you can find row houses that are only 15 feet wide. It's a very efficient way to get a lot of homes onto a single street. This is also a pretty inexpensive kind of construction type. This was the original workforce housing. If you go through neighborhoods that were built for people who worked in factories or at the docks and the ports, this was the housing that was built for them. Relatively quick and easy to build up. This works really nicely for ownership. For rental, you can configure it in a bunch of different ways on the inside to accommodate different kinds of families. Again, illegal to build in most cities today. Even in a lot of places where this exists, we have changed the zoning, so if you tore down these little skinny row houses, you couldn't rebuild them the way they are now today. We also used to build housing on top of retail pretty much everywhere. So this is a picture from San Diego. It's not just an East Coast and Midwest phenomenon. All over the country, we just had the habit of building ground floor retail and then apartments above it. This serves a couple of really nice purposes. One is that the small business owners can live on top of their store and just walk to work. We also used to have things like grocery stores and coffee shops in every neighborhood, so people could do their basic errands just walking within a few minutes of where they lived. Now you have to get into a car and drive 20 minutes to get to the closest supermarket to get a gallon of milk. So the zoning that we started adopting in about the 1920s, and particularly post-World War II, restricts housing to be much more uniform on a lot of dimensions. So not only it has to be a single-family detached house, but a uniform width in between the houses, so setbacks on either side, setbacks from the street, two-car garage. By the way, it becomes expensive when you start adding parking requirements. All of the houses have to be the same height, they have to be the same exterior materials. So all of these things enforce a uniformity in neighborhoods. And if we zoom out and think about what does that mean for the people who can afford to live in these neighborhoods, if all of the homes are the same size, the same age, and cost the same amount of money, then the people who live in those neighborhoods are going to have to earn basically the same amount of income, right? So we wind up having neighborhoods that are very homogeneous economically, that look homogeneous on the outside. These are also, as it turns out, not great neighborhoods for people over the entire course of their life cycle. These neighborhoods were basically designed around the idea that everybody was going to live in a two-parent family with a couple of kids, and they were going to need the space. Turns out lots of 20-somethings don't want to live in a neighborhood like this. They want to be someplace where they're in walking distance of restaurants and bars. They don't want to maintain a yard. It's also terrible for people who get older and don't want to do the outside maintenance or get to the point where they can't drive. And so we know, in fact, that these neighborhoods contribute to social isolation of a lot of older adults, and we are just at the tip of the iceberg. We are going to see much more of this going forward, and we really haven't grappled with how people can move away from these kinds of neighborhoods to places that fit them over their longer-term life cycle. So I want to make sure that we understand it's not just that there's this set of zoning codes and building codes that are just rules written down on a piece of paper. One of the most damaging things to our development process is that we have gone from a rules-based system that's pretty transparent to a discretionary approval process where local governments have basically outsourced approval over what gets built and what doesn't to people who already live in the community. How many of you have been to a community meeting where there's some sort of proposed change? You want to build something? Good. So you probably know what the experience is like. We've gone to the system where in order for a developer to change a parking lot into an apartment building or replace low-rise commercial with some homes, you have to show up on Tuesday night in your local community center and sit there for 5 hours listening to people yell into the microphone about this is going to bring in more traffic. This is going to cause crowding in our schools. What about the parking? I like my neighborhood character. I don't want it to change. Any of this sounding familiar? So I can understand that the people who live in a community already care very much about the place where they live. We all get attached to our neighborhoods. We like the way it looks. We like our routines. But what we have essentially done is give veto power to the people who are already here. And very often the people who would benefit from adding more homes, from adding apartments, from adding rental housing, cheaper housing than is there, the people who would benefit the most don't yet live in the community because they can't afford to. And they don't have the same kind of voice in the debate, and they don't have the opportunity to show up and say, actually, I'd love for there to be an apartment building because then I could live closer to my job. We know, for instance, that a lot of school teachers and nurses, people who work in communities, can't live in the communities where they work, that they have to live farther away and commute. So we have to find more of a balance where people get a chance to voice their opinions, but they don't get to veto anything they don't like. And by the way, if you try to build affordable housing for people who make lower than the median income, the problems get 100 times worse. If your neighbors don't want to have market rate apartments or luxury apartments, or however they term them, they're even less excited about having affordable housing for poor people. And so the process becomes even uglier. And I will say that if you've been to community meetings, this gets really nasty very quickly and in not very subtle terms. I live in Washington, D.C., which is traditionally an African-American city. And if you go to community meetings in the mostly white suburbs nearby, they will say, I don't want you to build affordable housing because then it'll turn into Anacostia, which is essentially a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. All of the people who live in the black parts of DC are going to move into our white neighborhood. So the process that we have set up empowers the people who live there currently who may not want neighbors that don't look like themselves. And we have essentially said, that's the way we're going to do it. So I want to shift gears a little bit away from the supply problem, which is a big piece of this, right? We're not building enough homes, we're not building diverse housing options. And I think Beth actually set this up really nicely in her opening remarks. When we talk about the poorest 20 to 25% of people living everywhere in the country, the real problem is that their incomes just haven't kept up with the cost of housing. And so they have to spend half of their income every month on rent just to find a place, right? The fair market rent of $1,000 a month, my guess is you probably can't find many of those if you start looking through Craigslist. There aren't even that many that are available. So people wind up living someplace they can't really afford. They're spending too much of their money on rent, which leaves them not enough left over to pay for food and transportation and clothing and all of their other necessities. We know that this is true all over the country. This is not just an expensive city place. Kansas City is a relatively affordable city compared to many parts of the US. We know that even in small towns and rural areas where housing costs are low in absolute terms, but incomes are even lower. So everywhere in the country, poor families are spending so much money that they have $400 left over to pay for everything else after rent. This is how we get people evicted. This is how we get people falling into homelessness because they just don't have the cash to maintain this. And it's important to understand that a lack of income is going to require a different policy solution than not having enough homes. We can change the zoning rules, we can build more homes. For middle income households, that will help a lot. For poor households, we have to give them more money. There's really no way around this other than providing subsidies. And the more direct ways we can give them money, just give them cash, universal basic income, making housing vouchers an entitlement, all of these would make the quality of life better for people. And all it takes is money, right? I mean, this is actually not a complicated thing to do if we had the political will to do it. The flip side of having not built enough homes in the right places is that we have built and continue to rebuild too many homes in places that we shouldn't from a climate perspective. One part of this is what Dennis showed you, that we are building our homes farther and farther out in places that require lots and lots of highways. It turns out that more people driving more miles is actually not great for climate change because it leads to more emissions. We also are building a lot of homes in places that catch on fire or flood over and over again, and we know that, and we keep building them there. So places like Florida and South Carolina and Texas are some of the fastest growing states in the country, and they have the highest rates of climate risk. How many of you have had your home insurance premiums go up in the last year? If you haven't yet, you will, because we have just got so many people and so many properties in places that are really high risk that insurance companies are actually starting to go out of business in places like Florida and California. The entire country's insurance system essentially is running on very thin margins, and that's going to take some kind of big fixes to do. But stopping, at the very least, stopping building in places that flood every year would be a good move. So the US has relied very heavily on homeownership as the primary way for households to build wealth. And for a lot of people, this works really well. You buy a house with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, you pay it off month by month, a little bit goes to the bank for interest, and some of it goes to your equity. And as you pay down the loan, you build up a nest egg, right? This allows people to borrow against that, to send their kids to college, to start a small business. They can sell their house and use that money in retirement. So we have essentially constructed a lot of federal tax incentives to encourage people to buy homes and build up wealth that way. The problem is, until relatively recently in our country's history, Black and Hispanic families were excluded legally from buying homes. They were excluded from being able to get access to mortgages, and realtors could just refuse to show homes to people. So our reliance on homeownership is essentially the entire root of the racial wealth gap. And even today, we know that more than 70% of white households own their own home. Fewer than half of Black and Latino households do. And when they do own homes, they tend to buy later in the business cycles. They get less appreciation, or they buy in neighborhoods where they do only one of many layers of policies that have enforced racial and economic segregation. Most of the de facto regulations can't be used to discriminate today, but zoning works to enforce segregation through economics. It turns out it's legal to discriminate against poor people, so by banning rental housing in a community, you ban poor people from moving into the community. Local governments are not disinterested parties in the question of what kind of housing gets built where. So local governments are responsible for raising taxes to pay for things like libraries and speaker series. Public schools take a big bite out of local budgets, parks, transportation. So local governments have to figure out how they're going to get revenues to pay for all of these services. And for most local governments, particularly residential suburbs, property taxes are really where they're getting most of their revenue. And so they charge property taxes on homes and on commercial properties, but this makes them very cautious when they think about what kinds of development they're allowing, how much additional revenue will this bring in, and how much is it going to cost me in services. Very often local governments do a really simple back of the envelope. If I allow only really large $1 million homes on large lots, that one house will bring in more for the same millage rate than a small, say, studio condo in a smaller building, right? So higher value homes for a 1% property tax just generate more money. But what we haven't done a good job is thinking about what the trade-offs are in terms of the demands on public services. It turns out that large single-family homes are actually much more likely to have families with kids who go to school, and small apartments tend to have people who don't have kids, and so they actually have somewhat less of an impact. And as Dennis pointed out also, we have been spending more and more of our money on infrastructure because we build things farther apart, right? So imagine that we're adding 1,000 homes on a single family subdivision spread out. The amount of paving you have to put in, the amount of pipes for water and sewer systems is more than if you put those in compact townhouses or in multifamily apartments. So we wind up approving these sort of large, low-density properties that wind up costing local governments more money. We've gotten to the point where so many communities have such restrictive regulations on the amount of housing we can add and the type of housing that it's not just a problem for individual communities. We actually see regional, state, and even national impacts on our growth. This has become very apparent during the past 4 years as people have become more mobile, with more people being able to telework, they're moving to other places, and we see that just the shortage of homes means that housing prices in places that have been affordable have been rising faster as people go looking for cheaper places to live. One of the upshots of this is that local governments don't necessarily have an incentive to build a ton more housing, but states are realizing that state-level economies are not growing as quickly as they could because employers have a hard time attracting and retaining workers. It's just too expensive because of the cost of housing. So to fix this whole laundry list of problems, we're going to need systemic changes at all levels of government. Fundamentally, local governments write the rules for what kind of housing can be built where, and the process which determines how long it takes and how much it costs. We need to reform these rules to allow more housing to be built faster, cheaper, more diverse housing options in every community. State governments have started getting much more interested in what they can do to incentivize local governments, either with fairly blunt tools like preempting local zoning, saying you're not allowed to ban duplexes, for instance, or providing some sort of a financial incentive. We will, for instance, offset the cost of infrastructure and school fees if you build more homes, right? So you build more, it's going to cost you something in services, we're going to help you cover that. And so state governments are really leaning into this. We have a really exciting time with a lot of experimentation going on. The next couple of years will help us figure out which of these policies are working. The single most important thing that the federal government could do would just be to provide cash assistance to low-income households so they can afford to live in decent quality homes without spending half of their income on rent. And this is really very much about investing in our future workforce. Many of the families that are rent burdened, that are living in poor quality housing or in neighborhoods that are not safe and healthy, many of those are families with kids. So we are starving our future citizens, our future workforce of living in places where they have the support that they need. And the federal government is the only entity that has deep enough pockets to solve this at a national scale. I've been trying to tell Congress that they should make housing vouchers an entitlement for everybody. Shockingly, they have not yet done that, but I'm going to keep yelling at them. None of the ideas that I put forward in the book are actually new policy suggestions. Many of these have been around for decades. There are lots of other smart academics, smart policymakers who know these are the right policies to do. We are just stuck in some very, very difficult politics where people are afraid to try new things. Many of the people who benefit from the current system also have more political power and are reluctant to see kind of changes. And the kinds of people who would benefit most from more affordable housing are often the least engaged, especially at the local level. So young households, renter households, people who've moved to a community recently, those are the ones who would really benefit from having more diverse and affordable housing, but they are less likely to register to vote, to show up and vote in mayoral elections and city council elections. And so part of what we have to do is learn how to engage a broader constituency and help them get engaged in ways that are constructive. So in the 2 years since the book came out, we've actually had lots of exciting things going forward. And so I try now to end on a somewhat more hopeful note. There's a lot of activity and a lot of conversation around this topic, which we didn't have even 5 or 6 years ago. I tried to pull a couple of local facts for you guys. You know better than I do, but this is showing you the FHFA's house price appreciation for the last year. So the Kansas City Metro, which still is quite affordable and traditionally has been affordable compared to a lot of other places, but your housing prices are going up faster probably than most of you are getting raises. So over the last year, they've gone up about almost 10%. Most of us didn't get a 10% raise last year. And this is actually pretty rapid compared to a lot of other parts of the country. That's actually something that we've seen in a number of the Midwest metros. So I was in Des Moines earlier this year, Minneapolis, Detroit has also seen stronger price appreciation. These are places that are a great deal and they offer a great quality of life, and it turns out that people who are priced out of Seattle and California have found that out and they want to come here. But they can afford to buy up a lot of housing for what they were paying before, and that's really showed up in rising prices and rents. One of the things that doesn't show up as obviously in just the price or rent is that we want to think too about the quality of the housing that's available. These numbers are probably a little small for you to see, but Jackson County, so this is county level data, Jackson County has substantially more old housing than most of the country does. Old housing can be really charming and lovely, but also sometimes it has some maintenance issues and needs to be upgraded and replaced. So part of the downside of not building enough new housing is that our housing remains online longer than it has before. Actually, the entire US housing stock is older than it's ever been since we started keeping track of that. And we're gonna need to put a substantial amount of money in to upgrade it and make it more resilient. So state level leadership has been one of the exciting things to watch recently. We've seen a number of states across the country really try to think about how they can incentivize more development, more diverse kinds of development. And this is a fun one to think about politically because it's not just the places like California and Massachusetts that are both very expensive and also tend to have very activist state governments. We're actually seeing a lot more interest from some of the Mountain West states. So Montana, Utah, Colorado have all passed statewide policies aimed at making housing more affordable, more diverse, and more abundant. Florida has a really exciting new law this year where they're encouraging more development in their commercial corridors, and that's actually generated quite a lot of new housing even in the year that it's been passed. So Kansas and Missouri have not, as far as I know, put something on the table. Minnesota is the Midwestern state that's done the most on this, but stay tuned to this space. And of course, a lot of this is actually coming from local grassroots action. We've seen an increasing number of these local YIMBY, for Yes in My Backyard groups. It's essentially meant to show up at community meetings as a counterbalance to the traditional NIMBYs. So you get lots of people who show up and say, neighborhood character, don't change anything. And now there are organized groups that show up and say, more apartments, that's great, we love this. We want to have more people living here that can support neighborhoods serving retail. So if there isn't a group yet in Kansas City, think about getting one off the ground. Coming from DC, I have to give a little bit of the federal perspective. The federal government has very limited policy levers over land use and production. Traditionally, the federal government has just provided subsidies, and mostly on the demand side, on the household side. But in the last 6 to 8 months, multiple congressional committees have held hearings on housing supply and affordability. So this is a new space for Congress. It's not something where they really know what to do. They don't have plans off the shelf. There are going to be a lot of limits to what they're able to do, and they need to tread pretty carefully. because there's just some constitutional barriers. One of the more interesting federal proposals is called YIGB, for Yes in God's Backyard, allowing faith-based organizations to develop affordable housing on property that they own. So a church that has a parking lot and wants to build some supportive housing, this is a really interesting one too, because it could potentially have bipartisan support. It's sort of a small carve-out, but it's something that would be interesting to try and see where it could go. Probably not sharing state secrets when I tell you Congress may not pass a lot of big legislation this year. They've got some other things going on, and they're not in full speed ahead mode, but I actually think it's really useful for them to be in study mode and thinking about this, putting together some plans, doing some background work so that at some point in the future they're ready to take more action. So I wrote the book not for people who are deeply in the weeds of housing policy. A lot of this is very familiar to planners and developers and architects. If you're in the housing space, you tend to think about people who are either traditional affordable housing advocates and live and breathe this every day. There are some hardcore YIMBYs and some hardcore NIMBYs, but it turns out that most voters and even most elected officials are in kind of this middle space. We notice when housing becomes more expensive. Elected officials notice when they start getting calls from constituents who are angry about it. That makes them sit up and pay attention. But most people don't have deeply held views on what the right solutions are. And that's actually a great place to be in because we can present them with information, we can give them some options on policies, and part of the reason that I wrote the book is to try to reach these people who just want to know what's going on, what some of the underlying causes are, and start to think about what are the range of options. Helping people understand that just because you live in a single-family neighborhood doesn't mean that that's the way the world has to be, and that we can start to question some of the policies that maybe we take for granted. Just putting these options out on the table and having a broader conversation about it makes it easier to think about different kinds of options and different kinds of policies that we could look at. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to your questions. And I think there are or will be microphones for...
Excellent. We are going to open it up for Q&A. Steve is going to be our moderator here. Do we have any online questions for our presenter?
We do not yet, but I would be happy to entertain you all while my colleague Leslie gets the microphone set up. We're going to have them up in these two aisles, and if you would step up to those to ask your question so that the people at home can hear your question as well as the answer, that would be appreciated. Any questions?
If we run out of questions here, I can tell you that I've been getting incoming calls from reporters this week asking about what Kamala Harris's housing policy is going to be, and the quick answer to that is I don't know yet.
Hi, my name's Paul. I was wondering if you could speak to, it wasn't one of the things that you addressed or was listed there, but to the financialization of housing. Specifically in our area, there was a report that came out in April from the Mid-America Regional Council that over 60% of the new homes purchased in the last couple of years in our most underserved communities were purchased by investors that owned a minimum of 10 properties. And I was curious what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, that's a question that's come up a lot recently, and I should say that this is actually an area where we don't know as much as we should about just sort of who owns housing, who owns rental housing. It turns out that it's often hard to map an individual apartment building or house back to the entity that owns it, because oftentimes they're owned through an LLC, and you don't know, is there sort of a master company that has a bunch of LLCs to own things. This has certainly been a question, particularly since the Great Recession. Some of the really big private equity firms, the big real estate investment companies have gotten more into buying up single-family homes and renting them out. That's actually not completely new. We've had single-family rentals in our rental ecosystem for a long time, but these very large companies that can sort of batch buy large numbers of them, nationally, it's still a really small share of the overall stock, right? So, 2/3 of Americans own their own homes. Of the 30% that are rental, most of those are still owned by small kind of mom and pop companies or family-owned businesses that don't own a lot. But in some cities and in some neighborhoods, the big investors are a larger share. It's not necessarily that they are all the private equity companies, though. So often you will have a locally owned real estate company that has a large share. I will say that there are a couple of things that specifically we worry about. One is that some of the corporate landlords are just not good landlords. They don't provide good quality housing, they don't fix maintenance problems when they occur, they maybe don't provide tenants with information on how to fix things. So like bad landlord behavior is bad landlord behavior, whether it's a big corporate entity or a mom and pop, or for that matter, a public agency or a nonprofit that owns affordable housing, right? A bad landlord behavior is bad. We worry also a little bit about the competition for first-time home buyers. It's a really hard time to buy a first home, and the corporate investors can pay all cash. They don't have to get a mortgage, and so, at the margin, there are some first-time home buyers who are getting outbid. The bigger problem for that is, though, there are 20 people trying to buy every house, and even if it doesn't go to a corporate investor, 19 people aren't going to get the house. So I think my general answer is we actually don't know enough about this, and one thing the federal government could do is require more disclosure, particularly from the really large companies that have cross-state portfolios. That's easier for the federal government to regulate, just to provide information. How many properties do you own? Local governments doing things like rent registries, so they know who are your biggest landlords, and then you can stay on top of them and find out, are your biggest landlords providing bad housing? Are they raising the rent by 30%? They might be, they might not actually be the biggest problem, but we should be trying to find that out. And then local governments also have resources to do things like make sure tenants know what their rights are. If your landlord isn't providing heat in the winter, they need to be, and you should know that there's a place that you can go or call and get help with that, right? What are your rights if the landlord tries to evict you or to not renew your lease? And so some of this is providing more support and resources to local governments who are really the ones interfacing with tenants and making sure that everybody, regardless of who your landlord is, should be living in decent quality, safe housing and should be treated fairly and with respect.
I live in a town about 40 miles west of here, Lawrence, Kansas. It's about 100,000 people, about 120 square miles, and they're in the process of updating their land development code this fall. It's left the steering committee, it's gone to the planning commission tonight. And they have advocated many of the changes. They've duplexes and triplexes by right, no parking, and a universal right for ADUs. However, most of the town, anything built after 1970, has covenants by the subdivisions or homeowners associations. Then they say in the covenants, this lot shall be used for single-family residential use only. And so you have this little core of older properties, and where people with lower incomes live over on the east side, and that is going to be affected. And everything else, they're saying, go for it, guys, because we're protected. And I see that as kind of an inequity, because they're going to get what they want and put the increased density on those without covenant. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is one of the kind of sneaky things that YIMBYs have not dealt with yet, that a lot of newer homes are built in HOAs, where the HOA rules essentially supersede local zoning. And I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what the mechanisms are to override that, but it's going to take a different kind of policy change. So if the local government changes their zoning and their land use plan, that doesn't automatically apply within areas that have covenants or that are HOAs. I know that California has started to push back and have some legal cases where fair housing lawyers are saying this should apply in HOAs and not just in other areas. So if you have some fair housing lawyers on speed dial, asking them if it's worth doing a test case, because you're absolutely right. Otherwise, some neighborhoods are going to be exempted from these kinds of changes more broadly.
question. Is there anywhere we can look to for examples where there's a win-win situation where the single-family owner whose house is his castle, some people argue, versus the efficiency, as we've seen, because we're really our infrastructure is going to cost us too much. So are there any cities that are doing it right, or are there ways to meet the owner either halfway or stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to look at is just a lot of the older neighborhoods that were built pre-current zoning are not single-family exclusive. They have single-family homes, and they have duplexes, and they have small apartment buildings, and they're fine, right? I mean, we built a lot of neighborhoods like that, and many of them are really charming, and people, pay extra to live there. I think a lot of also people who own a single-family house should be thinking about, if you add the ability potentially for something like an accessory dwelling unit, that gives you the option to bring in more income, right? Maybe you can turn your basement into a rental apartment or convert your backyard garage. That adds some income generating potential. When people decide that they want to sell their house and move, they want to move to a different city or retire, if your house could be redesigned as a duplex or something else, that adds to the value of the property. So there's sort of this tension. Most people would like to have flexibility for what to do with their house. They just don't want their neighbors to have flexibility with what they do, right? So like my neighbor shouldn't be able to paint their house magenta, but if I want to build an ADU, I should be able to do that. And of course you can't have it both ways. I think part of this is reassuring people adding a little bit of density, a little bit of change is not going to be visible overnight. The cities that have introduced some of these changes, land use changes slowly over time, right? So we see over 5 to 10 years, maybe about a 1% change in the properties in a neighborhood a year. So this is a very slow process, right? It's as a homeowner decides to change their property or to sell and somebody else does something else with it. So this is going to be a slow evolution, not a sudden shock to the system. It also turns out in a lot of the places that have adopted more flexible zoning, people fight beforehand, and then after it happens, they kind of forget about it, right? So even if an apartment building gets built across the street, in like a couple of years, people just walk by it, and it's not a big deal. We're more afraid of the change happening than we are afterwards. If the sky does not fall, it's okay.
I have a question. Was I correct in hearing that you used to work for the Federal Reserve on the introduction? My question to you, simply stated, is you never mentioned anything about Federal Reserve policy in your talk. No, I haven't read your book. What effect do you think that the Federal Reserve policy over my lifetime, which has been to cause inflation, to print money, has to do with the problem that we are now having all over the country with the housing? And I'll also specifically refer to up there on the slide, you have point number 4, give poor people money. Everybody wants money, but what do you think that's going to do to the value of money if you do that? Those are my questions. Policy of Federal Reserve, really.
So I'm going to punt a little bit on the first one because although I used to work for the Federal Reserve, I'm an urban economist. I actually don't know very much about monetary policy, and I didn't do that. I will say that it's very clear that high interest rates at the moment have made it more expensive for people to buy homes, right? So first-time home buyers are facing high prices and high interest rates, and that's a really difficult situation to be in. That's historically pretty unusual. Normally when interest rates go up, housing prices drop, and this time we haven't seen that because of the shortage. So the Federal Reserve will do what it does with interest rates, but until rates come down, getting into homeownership is just going to be very difficult, and we know that that's the case. One thing I will say about give poor people money, we've had a number of really interesting small pilot programs with what they call universal basic income, although it's not actually universal because they do a small pilot, so maybe 1,000 people in a city get access to this. It's generally not enough to drive overall sort of inflation and the price of most goods and services, but it does make an enormous difference in the stability of the households who get this, right? And one of the reasons why economists like the idea of giving people cash rather than giving them food stamps and housing vouchers is that cash is flexible and people can use it for different things month to month. So one month your car breaks down and you need to get it fixed. The next month you have a health emergency and you need to pay a doctor's bill. Middle-income households just have cash and we pay for things as we need them. Poor families really don't have that flexibility. So providing them with cash to be able to cover emergency expenses and to be able to stay current on their rent keeps them from getting evicted keeps their kids in school and able to do their homework. The social cost of having people who are really poor and unstably housed and living in poor quality housing that exacerbates health issues, we're paying for this. We're paying for this through public health. We're paying for this when we have homeless services. We're paying for this in kids who aren't showing up to school. It's not explicitly a bill that's coming to us, but all of us are paying for the cost of not having a social safety net.
Hi, I'm going to take this off because I'm tall. My name is Chad Gritman. I represent a group called Urban Lab KC. We're architects, engineers, and laypeople that advocate for urbanism principles, including things like this here in Kansas City. I've become a convert over the past year of land value tax. So there's a lot there. There's a lot you could talk about. I'd love to know your view on land value tax, especially in relation to catalyzing housing, catalyzing speculators from holding in lots for generations, et cetera. What's your research show? What do you think?
Yeah, and I'll give the 30-second version of land value tax for those of you who are not Georgists to the core, but you should become Georgists. So a land value tax, the idea is sort of like a property tax, but instead of the same rate that gets applied to the structure and to the land, that you can apply more of the tax to the land value, right? So the idea would be, for instance, if there's a parking lot, then it gets taxed essentially at the value of the land, right? Because there's no structure. And if the property owner decides to build an apartment building on top of the parking lot, you would still mostly be taxing it on the value of the land, and so they don't get penalized for improving the property, right? So one of the things that urban economists think should happen is that we would have fewer surface parking lots in places like New York and San Francisco, because the land is super expensive, and so you should build stuff on it that generates income, and at the moment we're taxing that. Interestingly, the city that is currently debating having a land value tax is actually Detroit, which has pretty cheap land, but what they have been doing is they've been losing a lot of people to the suburbs because Detroit has this massive aging infrastructure that it has to pay for, and not that many people still living in the city to pay for it. So long-term homeowners have really high tax rates, and in the suburbs they have much lower tax rates. So essentially what they want to do is lower the value of taxes on existing homes, push a little bit more of the revenue onto speculators who own vacant properties that they're not using, they're just sitting on them, so make them pay a little bit more for that. That, I think, has not yet gone through. I think it was up this year for the legislature. We don't have a ton of empirical evidence on how this would work because not many places have done it, and none of the expensive places with surface parking lots have done this yet. So that's the kind of test case you want to do. So I would say we have strong reason to believe that this would work. The details are a little complicated in working out. It's probably not going to be a pure land value tax. It would be a split rate where the land and the structure pay different amounts. Some state constitutions make that illegal, and so it's not feasible to try everywhere, but I would love to see more experimentation with this. I think it has a lot of potential, and we just need to try.
I think we'll go to these two questions over here, and then I'd like to finish up with two questions that we have asked from people watching at home.
So I agree with you when you say basically there's a lack of political will to get this done. Now, here in Kansas City, we have our city leaders and our Jackson County leaders pushing very strongly for a $2 billion tax subsidy for the Chiefs and the Royals. And it's my thought that what if we took that $2 billion and funneled it into affordable housing? And what a transformation that would make to this city. The number of jobs created would be phenomenal, from the foundation people to the roofers, to the framers, to the people that lay carpet, to the people that install the lighting. It just cascades on and on and on. We need that kind of political willpower.
Yes. I am not in any way going to argue that local governments should be giving money to sports stadiums or to teams. We actually have a lot of evidence that shows that that doesn't generate more economic growth. It just shifts people's entertainment budgets. And cities that chase after holding on to their teams by building new stadiums get burned every single time.
Hi there. So my question is about rising property taxes and displacement. So displacement and rising property taxes are a concern for lower income homeowners. But there's also a concern that any form of housing production around those homes will cause their value to increase and therefore higher taxes that would cause displacement. And that does include as well vacant and blighted properties as well. So besides tax abatement programs, which we do have several programs here in Missouri and Kansas City for abatement, what other strategies could be employed, and then how would you communicate those strategies to those who are concerned?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is particularly an issue for lower income homeowners, many of whom have been in the neighborhood for a long time. Many of them have actually paid off their mortgage, so the property tax may be one of the biggest monthly expenses they get. Mostly we have done this through property tax abatements, and those can be targeted in different ways. Sometimes it's based on income, sometimes it's based on age, because this is particularly an issue for older homeowners. Those are pretty effective in, just people don't have to pay the taxes. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem of if people are in homes that they can't afford to maintain, which is often the case too. Philadelphia has a pretty extensive program trying to provide low-cost maintenance and upgrades so that people can stay in their home, right? So that we don't want people to be displaced and have no place to go. If we can put in a new boiler, a new water heater, and keep them in their house for another 10 years, we should do that, right? And that's often fairly low cost to the individual homeowner, but you have to have a program that's pretty well organized for that. Local governments have kind of limited tools to directly offset costs. Mostly they don't have kind of a pot of money available for that. And so the property tax abatement is just the most common tool that we have.
Thank you. We'll finish up real quick with two questions from people watching at home. The first one is, climate resiliency is made better with multifamily homes, yet many builders in Kansas City point to climate regulations as a cause to stop building. Have you encountered this elsewhere, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I should say that there are different kinds of climate-related regulations. So they're not all the same. We have regulations both on sustainability, so things like the energy efficiency of homes, and then the resiliency side would be things like using exterior materials that don't burn or elevating homes in flood zones. The cost of some of these climate-related regulations can vary a lot. So for instance, like elevating a home, it turns out is really, really expensive. Changing the exterior materials of a home that's already been built, usually quite expensive. Bolting the roof onto the house so it doesn't blow off when you have high winds, something like $2,000, right? So some of this is figuring out a better kind of cost-benefit test. What are the kinds of things that we could be doing that aren't super expensive but make homes both more energy efficient and more resilient, and what are the things that really are just very expensive? Builders have a tendency to push back against new regulations and more regulations because they have to change what they've been doing, and they don't like doing that. Some of it is the pace of change of regulations. So there are places that add new regulations every year or do frequent changes, and that's just hard to adapt to, right? So sort of having a predictable schedule when these go into effect. I would say there are places that we just shouldn't be building at all. And it's hard to say, don't build over here when we have an overall shortage of homes. The only way that works is if we're allowed to build more homes in the places that are going to be safe, and that we make sure that the new construction that gets built is as resilient as we can make it. In general, newer homes are built to higher climate standards on both efficiency and resiliency than older homes. Our building codes have gotten tighter. So replacing older homes with newer homes and gradually shifting away from the riskiest areas is what we need to do. But that's not a fast strategy, and time is a really important issue here.
And then the last question is, there are 5 companies that own 8,000 rental properties in Kansas City. How can we make sure that some of those homes are for low income, or is there a way to do that?
So this is an area where having a rental registry would be really helpful, and just knowing who the big landlords are and doing some strategic outreach, whether they're in the city or the county, sort of maybe cooperating and working through your regional MPO would be useful. knowing your big landlords and keeping track of them makes a lot of sense for a bunch of reasons, right? When the pandemic hit and we tried to get emergency rental assistance out, it turned out we didn't know who were renters and we didn't know who all the landlords were, and we didn't have lines of communication to do that. So, talk to your local foundations about getting some grants to do an initial rental registry, focus on the largest ones to start with, and then start thinking about what you can do. Are you doing kind of annual checks? Ask them sort of what's the average rent increase, and ask them how long it takes them to respond when there's a maintenance request. It may be that your big landlords are the problem. It may be that those are actually not the worst landlords, because often they're professional companies that have on-site management. So just getting some information is a great starting point.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, and thank you all for joining us tonight.